This history of the telephone chronicles the development of the electrical telephone, and includes a brief review of its earlier predecessors. Telephone prehistory. Mechanical devices before the invention of electromagnetic telephones. Mechanical, acoustic devices existed for transmitting speech and music over a distance greater than that of normal direct speech. The earliest mechanical telephones were based on sound transmission through pipes or other physical media. The acoustic tin can telephone, or lover's phone, has been known for centuries. It connects two diaphragms with a taut string or wire, which transmits sound by mechanical vibrations from one to the other along the wire. The classic example is the children's toy made by connecting the bottoms of two paper cups, metal cans, or plastic bottles with tautly held string. Among the earliest known experiments were those conducted by the British physicist and polymath Robert Hooke from 1664 to 1685. An acoustic string phone made in 1667 is attributed to him. For a short period of time, acoustic telephones were marketed commercially as a niche competitor to the electrical telephone, as they preceded the latter's invention and didn't fall within the scope of its patent protection. When Alexander Graham Bell's telephone patent expired and many new telephone manufacturers began competing for customers, acoustic telephone makers quickly went out of business. Their maximum range was very limited, but hundreds of technical innovations, resulting in about 300 patents, increased their range to approximately a half-mile or more under ideal conditions. An example of one such company was the Pulsion Telephone Supply Company, created by Lemuel Mellett in Massachusetts, which designed its version in 1888 and deployed it on railroad right-of-ways. Additionally, speaking tubes have long remained common, including a lengthy history within buildings and aboard ships, and can still be found in use today. Electrical devices. The telephone emerged from the making and successive improvements of the electrical telegraph. In 1804, Spanish polymath and scientist Francisco Salva Campillo constructed an electrochemical telegraph. An electromagnetic telegraph was created by Baron Schilling in 1832. Carl Friedrich Gauss and Wilhelm Weber built another electromagnetic telegraph in 1833 in Göttingen. The first ever electrical telegraph was constructed by Sir William Fothergill Cooke and entered use on the Great Western Railway in England. It ran for 13 miles from Paddington Station to West Drayton and came into operation on April 9, 1839. Another electrical telegraph was independently developed and patented in the United States in 1837 by Samuel Morse. His assistant, Alfred Vail, developed the Morse code signaling alphabet with Morse. America's first telegram was sent by Morse on January 6, 1838, across 2 miles of wiring. Invention of the telephone. Credit for the invention of the electric telephone is frequently disputed, and new controversies over the issue have arisen from time to time. Charles Bourcel, Antonio Meucci, Johann Philipp Reis, Alexander Graham Bell, and Elisha Gray, amongst others, have all been credited with the telephone's invention. The early history of the telephone became and still remains a confusing morass of claims and counterclaims, which were not clarified by the huge mass of lawsuits to resolve the patent claims of many individuals and commercial competitors. The Bell and Edison patents, however, were commercially decisive, because they dominated telephone technology and were upheld by court decisions in the United States. Antonio Meucci, 1854, constructed telephone-like devices. Johann Philipp Reis, 1860, constructed prototype, make-and-break telephones, today called Reis telephone. Alexander Graham Bell was awarded the first U.S. patent for the invention of the telephone in 1876. Elisha Gray, 1876, designed a telephone using a water microphone in Highland Park, Illinois. Tivadar Puskás invented the telephone switchboard exchange in 1876. Thomas Edison invented the carbon microphone, which produced a strong telephone signal. The modern telephone is the result of work of many people. Alexander Graham Bell was, however, the first to patent the telephone, as an apparatus for transmitting vocal or other sounds telegraphically. Bell has most often been credited as the inventor of the first practical telephone. However, in Germany, Johann Philipp Reis is seen as a leading telephone pioneer who stopped only just short of a successful device. And as well, the Italian-American inventor and businessman Antonio Meucci has been recognized by the U.S. House of Representatives for his contributory work on the telephone. Several other controversies also surround the question of priority of invention for the telephone. The Elisha Gray and Alexander Bell telephone controversy considers the question of whether Bell and Gray invented the telephone independently and, if not, whether Bell stole the invention from Gray. This controversy is narrower than the broader question of who deserves credit for inventing the telephone, for which there are several claimants. The Canadian parliamentary motion on Alexander Graham Bell article reviews the controversial June 2002 United States House of Representatives resolution recognizing Meucci's contributions in the invention of the telephone. The same resolution was not passed in the U.S. Senate, thus labeling the House resolution as political rhetoric. A subsequent counter-motion was unanimously passed in Canada's Parliament 10 days later, which declared Bell its inventor. This webpage examines critical aspects of both the parliamentary motion and the congressional resolution. Invention of the telephone exchange in the era of the electrical telegraph, post offices, railway stations, the more important governmental centers, stock exchanges, very few nationally distributed newspapers. The largest internationally important corporations and wealthy individuals were the principal users of such telegraphs. Despite the fact that telephone devices existed before the invention of the telephone exchange, their success and economical operation would have been impossible on the same schema and structure of the contemporary telegraph. Prior to the invention of the telephone exchange switchboard, early telephones were hardwired to and communicated with only a single other telephone. A telephone exchange is a telephone system located at service centers responsible for a small geographic area that provided the switching or interconnection of two or more individual subscriber lines for calls made between them, rather than requiring direct lines between subscriber stations. This made it possible for subscribers to call each other at homes, businesses, or public spaces. These made telephony an available and comfortable communication tool for everyday use, and it gave the impetus for the creation of a whole new industrial sector. The first commercial telephone exchange in the world was opened at New Haven, Connecticut, with 21 subscribers on the 28th of January 1878. In a storefront of the Boardman Building in New Haven, Connecticut. George W. Coy designed and built the world's first switchboard for commercial use. Coy was inspired by Alexander Graham Bell's lecture at the Skiff Opera House in New Haven on the 27th of April 1877. In Bell's lecture, during which a three-way telephone connection with Hartford and Middletown was demonstrated, he first discussed the idea of a telephone exchange for the conduct of business and trade. On the 3rd of November 1877, Coy applied for and received a franchise from the Bell Telephone Company for New Haven and Middlesex counties. Coy, along with Herrick P. Frost and Walter Lewis, who provided the capital, established the District Telephone Company of New Haven on the 15th of January 1878. The switchboard built by Coy was, according to one source, constructed of carriage bolts, handles from teapot lids and bustle wire. According to the company records, all the furnishings of the office, including the switchboard, were worth less than $40. While the switchboard could connect as many as 64 customers, only 2 conversations could be handled simultaneously and 6 connections had to be made for each call. The District Telephone Company of New Haven went into operation with only 21 subscribers, who paid $1.50 per month. by the 21st of February 1878, however, when the first telephone directory was published by the company, 50 subscribers were listed. Most of these businesses and listings, such as physicians, the police, and the post office, only 11 residences were listed, 4 of which were for persons associated with the company. The New Haven District Telephone Company grew quickly and was reorganized several times in its first years. By 1880, the company had the right from the Bell Telephone Company to service all of Connecticut and western Massachusetts. As it expanded, the company was first renamed Connecticut Telephone, and then Southern New England Telephone in 1882. The site of the first telephone exchange was granted a designation as a National Historic Landmark on the 23rd of April 1965. However, it was withdrawn in 1973 in order to demolish the building and construct a parking garage. In 1887, Puskers introduced the multiplex switchboard, that had an epochal significance in the further development of telephone exchange. Early telephone developments. The following is a brief summary of the history of the development of the telephone. 1667. Robert Hooke invented a string telephone that conveyed sounds over an extended wire by mechanical vibrations. It was to be termed an acoustic, or mechanical, telephone. 1753. Charles Morrison proposes the idea that electricity can be used to transmit messages, by using different wires for each letter. 1844. Innocenzo Manzetti first mooted the idea of the speaking telegraph. 1854. Charles Bourcel writes a memorandum on the principles of the telephone. 1854. Antonio Meucci demonstrates an electric voice-operated device in New York. It is not clear what kind of device he demonstrated. 1861. Philip Race constructs the first speech-transmitting telephone. The 28th of December 1871, Antonio Meucci files a patent caveat at the U.S. Patent Office for a device he named Sound Telegraph. 1872, Elisha Gray establishes Western Electric Manufacturing Company. The 1st of July 1875, Bell uses a bidirectional Gallios telephone that was able to transmit voice-like sounds but not clear speech. Both the transmitter and the receiver were identical membrane electromagnet instruments. 1875. Thomas Edison experiments with acoustic telegraphy and in November builds an electrodynamic receiver, but does not exploit it. 1875. Hungarian Tivadar Puskers arrived in the USA. The 6th of April 1875, Bell's U.S. Patent 161,739, transmitters and receivers for electric telegraphs, is granted. This uses multiple vibrating steel reeds in make-break circuits, and the concept of multiplexed frequencies. The 20th of January 1876. Bell signs and notarizes his patent application for the telephone. The 11th of February 1876. Elisha Gray designs a liquid transmitter for use with a telephone, but does not build one. The 7th of March 1876. Bell's U.S. Patent No. 174,465 for the telephone is granted. The 10th of March 1876. Bell transmits the sentence, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you," using a liquid transmitter and an electromagnetic receiver. The 30th of January 1877. Bell's U.S. Patent No. 186,787 is granted for an electromagnetic telephone using permanent magnets, iron diaphragms, and a call bell. The 27th of April 1877. Edison files for a patent on a carbon transmitter. Patent No. 474,230 was granted on the 3rd of May 1892, after a 15-year delay because of litigation. Edison was granted Patent No. 222,390 for a carbon granules transmitter in 1879. The 6th of October 1877. The Scientific American publishes the invention from Bell, at that time still without her ringer, the 25th of October 1877. The article in the Scientific American is discussed at the Telegraphenamt in Berlin, the 12th of November 1877. The first commercial telephone company enters telephone business in Friedrichsburg, close to Berlin, using the Siemens pipe as ringer and telephone devices built by Siemens. 1877. The first experimental telephone exchange in Boston. 1877. First long-distance telephone line. 1877. Emil Berliner invented the telephone transmitter. The 28th of January 1878. The first commercial U.S. telephone exchange opened in New Haven, Connecticut. 1887. Tivadar Puskás introduced the multiplex switchboard. 1915. First U.S. coast-to-coast long-distance telephone call, ceremonially inaugurated by A.G. Bell in New York City and his former assistant Thomas Augustus Watson in San Francisco, California. Early commercial instruments. Early telephones were technically diverse. Some used liquid transmitters which soon went out of use. Some were dynamic. Their diaphragms vibrated a coil of wire in the field of a permanent magnet or vice versa. This kind survived in small numbers through the 20th century in military and maritime applications where its ability to create its own electrical power was crucial. Most, however, used Edison, Berliner carbon transmitters, which were much louder than the other kinds, even though they required induction coils, actually acting as impedance-matching transformers to make it compatible to the line impedance. The Edison patents kept the Bell monopoly viable into the 20th century, by which time telephone networks were more important than the instrument. Early telephones were locally powered, using a dynamic transmitter or else powering the transmitter with a local battery. One of the jobs of outside plant personnel was to visit each telephone periodically to inspect the battery. During the 20th century, common battery operation came to dominate, powered by torque battery from the telephone exchange over the same wires that carried the voice signals. Late in the century, wireless handsets brought a revival of local battery power. The earliest telephones had only one wire for both transmitting and receiving of audio, and used a ground return path, as was found in telegraph systems. The earliest dynamic telephones also had only one opening for sound, and the user alternately listened and spoke into the same hole. Sometimes the instruments were operated in pairs at each end, making conversation more convenient but also more expensive. At first, the benefits of a switchboard exchange were not exploited. Instead, telephones were leased in pairs to the subscriber, for example one for his home and one for his shop, who must arrange with telegraph contractors to construct a line between them. Users who wanted the ability to speak to 3 or 4 different shops, suppliers, etc., would obtain and set up 3 or 4 pairs of telephones. Western Union, already using telegraph exchanges, quickly extended the principle to its telephones in New York City and San Francisco, and Bell was not slow in appreciating the potential. Signaling began in an appropriately primitive manner. The user alerted the other end, or the exchange operator, by whistling into the transmitter. Exchange operation soon resulted in telephones being equipped with a bell, first operated over a second wire and later with the same wire using a condenser. Telephones connected to the earliest Strauger automatic exchanges had 7 wires, 1 for the knife switch, 1 for each telegraph key, 1 for the bell, 1 for the push button and 2 for speaking. Rural and other telephones that were not on a common battery exchange had hand-cranked magneto generator to produce an alternating current to ring the bells of other telephones on the line and to alert the exchange operator. In 1877 and 1878, Edison invented and developed the carbon microphone used in all telephones along with the bell receiver until the 1980s. After protracted patent litigation, a federal court ruled in 1892 that Edison and not Emil Berliner was the inventor of the carbon microphone. The carbon microphone was also used in radio broadcasting and public address work through the 1920s. In the 1890s, a new smaller style of telephone was introduced, the Candlestick Telephone, packaged in 3 parts. The transmitter stood on a stand, known as a candlestick, for its shape, hence the name. When not in use, the receiver hung on a hook with a switch in it, known as a switch hook. Previous telephones required the user to operate a separate switch to connect either the voice or the bell. With the new kind, the user was less likely to leave the phone off the hook. In phones connected to magneto exchanges, the bell, induction coil, battery, and magneto were in a separate bell box called a ringer box. In phones connected to common battery exchangers, the ringer box was installed under a desk, or other out-of-the-way place, since it did not need a battery or magneto. Cradle designs were also used at this time, having a handle with the receiver and transmitter attached, separate from the cradle base that housed the magneto crank and other parts. They were larger than the candlestick, and more popular. Disadvantages of single-wire operation, such as crosstalk and hum from nearby AC power wires, had already led to the use of twisted pairs and, for long-distance telephones, 4-wire circuits. Users at the beginning of the 20th century did not place long-distance calls from their own telephones but made an appointment to use a special sound-proofed long-distance telephone booth furnished with the latest technology. Around 1893, the country leading the world in telephones per 100 persons was Sweden with 0.55 in the whole country but 4 in Stockholm. This compares with 0.4 in the USA for that year. Telephone service in Sweden developed through a variety of institutional forms. The International Bell Telephone Company, Town and Village Cooperatives, the General Telephone Company of Stockholm, and the Swedish Telegraph Department. Since Stockholm consists of islands, telephone service offered relatively large advantages, but had to use submarine cables extensively. Competition between Bell Telephone and General Telephone, and later between General Telephone and the Swedish Telegraph Department, was intense. In 1893, the U.S. was considerably behind Sweden, New Zealand, Switzerland, and Norway in teledensity. The U.S. became the world leadership in teledensity with the rise of many independent telephone companies after the Bell patents expired in 1893 and 1894.